Hello, everyone. So in this video today, we're going to look at the presidency of Richard Nixon, some of the domestic aspects of his presidency, specifically where we're going to look at um, kind of the distinction between rhetoric and policy during the Nixon era, which are in many ways oftentimes very much at odds with one another. Um, Nixon, um, in running and eventually winning the presidency in 1968, tapped into growing cultural antagonisms that emerged as a result of both the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And he did so by speaking in advocation of states' rights and promising to bring about law and order, and basically by demonizing both the anti war movement and the civil rights movement. Now, I've already gone into some detail about how Nixon ultimately accomplishes this through, in some cases, illegal means. So I'm not going to revisit that too much, other than to say that he is largely successful in splintering the opposition to the Vietnam War by portraying the anti-war movement as through this very class-based kind of argument and portraying this idea of the silent majority, this idea that anti-war activists came from this elite background, that their views were out of step with mainstream America, and that their actions were by extension essentially un-American. So Nixon is very successful in doing that, in galvanizing you know kind of an anti-war movement, if you will, in this manner. But that's not the only area where Nixon seeks to, really kind of build a wedge between what had historically and traditionally been key components of the Democratic coalition since the New Deal. Since the 1930s, the Democratic coalition had consisted in more or less equal parts of northern, urban, working class white, oftentimes unionized voters, so-called white ethnics, as they came to be known in the 1970s, who were disproportionately Catholic, and who were of comparatively recent immigrant stock, Irish, Polish, Italian immigrants, and so that's one component of the Democratic coalition. Then there's also in the North African Americans who become an increasingly important part of the Democratic coalition after 1934, and then you have white Southerners. Now, already by the late 60s, white Southerners, because of the successes of the civil rights movement, which had been pushed through by a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, were beginning to defect from the Democratic coalition. And so Nixon sought to further um, engage their support, as well as to siphon off support from white working class voters in the North by launching a political campaign using heightened racialized rhetoric, portraying many of the liberal reforms of the Johnson administration, the Great Society War on Poverty programs, through extremely racialized terms. Um, this over time developed into a rather sophisticated political operation that has since become known as the Southern Strategy, again, because it principally focused on wooing voters, disaffected Democratic voters in the South. But again, it also sought to splinter working class support away from the Democratic Party in the North by dividing basically the white and the black working class in that part of the country as well. And so this is a strategy that Nixon pursues with increasing effectiveness throughout his presidency. It would ultimately become one of the key components of his 1972 reelection campaign, which would ultimately pay off for him quite spectacularly. Um, but the interesting thing about this, looking at it from this perspective of this time period, is that Nixon's oftentimes, you know, incendiary kind of rhetoric on issues of race and his kind of cultivation of this sort of racial backlash isn't necessarily matched with the actions of his own administration, which in and of itself reflects the fact that at the time Nixon assumes power in 1968, and for the duration of his presidency, really all the way up until the end of the 1970s, the United States is in the middle of a period of massive political transformation. As a new conservative majority becomes increasingly ascendant, and the old liberal New Deal coalition begins to lose momentum and eventually support throughout the decade. But this isn't reflected immediately. Nixon's election in 1968 does not immediately bring about this sudden shift in paradigm from a largely liberal pro-government philosophy to a conservative, oftentimes decidedly anti-government mentality that would eventually seize the reins of power with Ronald Reagan in 1980. It's a process. Like anything, it's a process. And at the time that Nixon is president, his political opponents, both within the Democratic Party, which controls both chambers of Congress throughout his presidency, as well as many factions within his own Republican Party that are oftentimes resistant to the kind of racialized populism that Nixon oftentimes advocates and oftentimes hold moderate, even socially liberal positions on a wide range of policy items. Um, there's this disconnect between the rhetoric and the action of the Nixon administration. And a good example of this is within Nixon's own administration, his own White House. Almost all the people that fill up Nixon's cabinet, with the notable exception of National Security Advisor Henry and eventually Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, come from the moderate Eastern establishment wing of the party that is broadly supportive of civil rights, that is broadly supportive of government actions on a wide range of areas, whether it's environmental regulation or integration or in support of feminism, which we'll be discussing shortly. Many of the people in the Nixon administration come from this more socially liberal to moderate wing of the Republican Party. But then you also have some, pretty significant hardliners in the administration who increasingly embrace, like I said, this oftentimes sort of racialized, this kind of culture of resentment of and reactionary backlash to the civil rights movement. And you see that represented in people like speechwriter Pat Buchanan and Vice President Spiro Agnew, who becomes famous during this time period for delivering these oftentimes very colorful speeches that use oftentimes kind of ridiculous examples of alliteration to characterize the Nixon administration's political opponents. I think the most famous example of this is when Agnew describes his opponents as the nadering nabobs of negativity. It's just one example. There's many others. So there's, again, this sort of internal battle, if you will, within the Nixon administration ideologically between those who embrace this new language of racialized resentment and those who do not. And so there's this disconnect when you look at policy. And in actuality, although Nixon oftentimes uses this sort of reactionary language of racialized resentment, his the record of his administration in terms of the policies it pursues is oftentimes quite liberal. A good example of this actually comes very early in his presidency in 1969, when his chief economic advisor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat who had served in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, proposes something that comes to be known as the Family Assistance Plan. Basically, what the Family Assistance Plan, for any of you who've been following American politics in the last year, is basically what Andrew Yang put forward as his principal plank in the 2020 presidential campaign, which is a universal basic income. Um, the Family Assistance Plan that Nixon proposes in 1969, in which he pushes for at various points um, throughout his presidency, was basically a very liberal policy that was designed to provide, a floor for living conditions and ensure that all Americans had a basic minimum in terms of living conditions and living standards, but which was again framed in very conservative terms. When Nixon tried to sell the Family Assistance Plan, he famously portrayed it as a conservative policy. He basically said, "Well, this is going to streamline the welfare bureaucracy in this country. It'll allow us to get rid of a lot of the red tape created by these myriad programs of the War on Poverty and the Great Society that Johnson had created. Instead, we're just going to have this one simple, streamlined program that's going to provide, a minimum, basic, kind of standard of living for people." It was $1,600 for a family of four at the time period, which is roughly around $12,000 in today's money, $15,000 in today's money. Obviously, not enough for people to completely subsist on alone without having some other supplemental source of income. Um, and it's because of that that it ultimately ends up failing. That's one of the reasons. Basically, um, many liberals and many Democrats rejected the Family Assistance Plan because they thought that its terms weren't generous enough, that it was too stingy, while many conservatives rejected it because they thought it was socialistic in nature. So, it ends up a failure, but it does illustrate how many very liberal policy proposals were oftentimes repackaged with this conservative language during the Nixon administration. Now, moving back to the issue of race, here as well, the Nixon administration's record was decidedly oftentimes at odds with Nixon's own stated policy preferences. Um, when Nixon ran in 1968 and promised, states' rights and restoring of law and order, he's kind of tapping into that resentment too and that reaction against the civil rights movement. Yet, his administration, or at least several key members of his cabinet, like George Romney of the Housing and Urban Development, and Robert Finch in Housing, Education, and Welfare, they advocate broadly integrationist policies. Romney tried to implement components of the 1968 Fair Housing Law, and to ensure that communities weren't engaging in activities designed specifically to keep African Americans or other minorities from buying homes in suburban communities, which had by this point become almost completely white in the United States. Um, and with Robert Finch and education, there's early on this very strong effort to integrate public schools in the United States, something which in some parts of the country leads to leaders turning what have been public schools into private academies so that they can then determine who will and will not be allowed to attend, which of course means that they're going to decline African American students. So there's again this disconnect between rhetoric and action. Um, but Nixon still manages to very effectively cultivate this, kind of racialized language and this opposition to civil rights as a main component. In 1969, shortly after he becomes president, he tries twice unsuccessfully to put Southern segregationists on the Supreme Court. In both instances, they are rejected by a broad bipartisan consensus because of their very obvious past records of support for segregation. But in spite of his setbacks there, uh, Nixon does find a wedge issue that enables him to again portray himself as being on the side of the silent majority on the issue of race in 1971 when the Supreme Court hands down a landmark decision, Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. Basically, since the Brown decision in 1954, in many parts of the country, especially interestingly enough in northern urban areas like St. Louis and Detroit, there have been significant resistance to integration. And so, what the Swan decision did is it basically had given the green light to a plan in Charlotte, North Carolina, to use busing as a means to achieve racial integration. And so, following the Swan decision, many school boards around the country began contemplating various busing proposals to try to integrate school facilities nationwide. And this is something which is further backed up by a series of lower court decisions that kind of augment and add to the Swan decision. And Nixon really capitalizes on this politically. He comes out very forcefully against this. He calls it forced busing, and he calls for a national moratorium. And so, by using the busing issue, um, he is able to once again capitalize on that growing racial backlash to build political power for himself. Eventually, the Supreme Court in the 1974 Milliken v. Bradley decision, by which point the court had been filled up but with four justices appointed by Nixon himself, substantially, if not reverses itself from the Swan decision, definitely backtracks quite a bit. In the Milliken v. Bradley decision, the Supreme Court basically throws out a lower court decision that had ordered integration through busing in Detroit, in districts that had been where district lines have been drawn in such a way as to prevent African Americans from attending white schools. The Milliken decision basically rejected the saying unless there was a clear evidence of foul intent or racial animus, that integration in this manner couldn't be forced, and that it didn't violate the 14th Amendment's guaranteed equal protection under the law. So, through using the lens of the issue of race, Nixon is able to tap into this growing working class backlash to the Great Society and to the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement, and is very effective in doing all this. Another issue that would emerge during this time period, that it would eventually provide one of the major avenues for the remaking of American politics, in which, along with galvanizing, kind of racial animosities, would end up being a major component in the remaking of American politics, is the emergence of the feminist movement in the United States during the late 60s and early 1970s, which is what I'll be discussing in my next video.